Okay, last unit we looked at the structural stability rebuilt in Europe thanks to the roles of feudalism and the Catholic Church, but at the very end we started to see some cracks in this foundation. This unit we're going to be shifting and looking at the challenge to authority. So this is topic 9.1, the origins of the Renaissance. The goal here is to be able to explain how older medieval systems like feudalism, for example, and the Catholic Church began to be challenged and why the Renaissance emerged first in Italy before spreading to the rest of Europe. So you remember the last unit, the old systems were beginning to be questioned at the very end. Medieval Europe was still shaped largely by feudalism and the Catholic Church. They had a lot of power. And this power was traditionally based on two things: ownership of land and religious legitimacy. That is, I control the land that you need for survival, and the Catholic Church is saying that I deserve to be in charge. Knowledge itself was largely controlled by religious institutions. There aren't a lot of books around, there aren't exactly schools. If you want to get educated, generally all the knowledge is being held by the Catholic Church, and so you have to go to them for information. And that gives them a lot of power over society, much like we saw knowledge being used as a justification of power in the Maya civilizations we saw way back in Unit 7. The social roles in this system of feudalism are fixed at birth. If you're born into a peasant family, you are a peasant. If you're born into a noble family, you are a noble. Kingship gets passed down from father to son. And so birth decides your status, and tradition keeps all this going. But over time, we saw these systems begin to show limits and tensions. For instance, the towns and cities start to kind of regrow, and wealth is being generated, which creates new social groups, and new ideas are creating pressure for change. After all, right, if you've got a lot of money, but you don't have a lot of land, you still see yourself as better than the peasant class and deserving of more rights and privileges in society. But under the feudal system, you don't own land, so you're no better than a peasant. And this is going to cause tension that's going to boil over. Part of this tension is expressed in this period we know as the Renaissance, a period of cultural and intellectual change. It's not a sudden break from the past. Instead, it's better to think of this as a shift of focus, right? A shift away from thinking about the afterlife and the spiritual world, and a focus more about learning about this world, getting education, and this cultural achievement in arts and sciences and engineering. So less focus of learning on, say, the afterlife and religious texts, and more focus on learning about the world around you. This doesn't mean that God and religion is no longer a main part of life in Western Europe. It still is very much so. It's just that the focus starts to shift. Being trying to better understand the world that God created, not saying that God does not exist. Part of this has to do with a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman ideas. So a famous painting here, the School of Athens, the Renaissance painting. And if you look closely, right, if you knew who some of these figures are, you'll see figures like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, these ancient philosophers whose ideas are, hundreds, if not a couple thousand years old at this point. Their ideas are starting to be rediscovered by the Western Europeans. And they also start to paint, for instance, not just classical philosophers, but Aphrodite, for instance, and Greek gods and figures become a way to paint and explore these old ideas without seeing it being seen as a challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church. Because after all, no one took the Greek gods seriously anymore, so the Church didn't see that as threatening. This learning really is a greater attention on human experience, on human achievement, and human potential. That is a real focus of the Renaissance. So while the subjects still are religious, right? Da Vinci's The Last Supper. The subject of this is Jesus of Nazareth, that is the last dinner before he gets crucified by the Romans. Here you see Mary and Jesus sculpted out of a single piece of marble. David, from the story of he's the ancient Hebrew king, David and Goliath. These are all religious subjects, but if you look, right, the focus here in the painting is how to make it more realistic, studying the human body and making the art reflect that. You can see that even in the stonework of the great sculptors of the age, really studying the human body, trying to really figure out what it is that makes us human. And while they're, yes, artists, they're also scientists exploring human anatomy and exploring the natural world in order to better reflect that in their art. So these artists, again, not just artists, they're really kind of proto-scientists at this point. What causes renewed interest in the classical learning and in the natural world? Well, one of the causes here is the flow of knowledge back into Western Europe from the ancient world, right? Classical Greek and Roman ideas, they had kind of died off in Western Europe. They weren't really to be found here, but a lot of that knowledge was found in the Byzantine Empire, who had been preserving the ancient texts of the Greeks and the Romans. These ideas were not lost to the Byzantines. The Byzantines, again, were just the Romans, and they were still using these ideas. And they were maintaining and building on the ancient works in philosophy, science, and mathematics, and really continuing to push those ideas forward. But in 1453, Byzantine power declined, and the empire completely fell as the Ottomans destroyed the walls of Constantinople and broke through. Many of these scholars who before that period, as they kind of saw the writing on the wall, were leaving Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, and they were moving west to Rome with this knowledge because, well, that's where the big cities were in Western Europe. Rome was still, pretty populated. Nowhere near as big as it was in the time of the Roman rule and Roman glory, but it was still pretty big. And so this was kind of a place a lot of these scholars fled to when the Byzantine Empire was no longer seen as safe. And they brought texts and language skills and books and ideas to the Italian cities, and people in the West were like, whoa, we totally forgot about these things. We had no idea about this stuff. And these new ideas start to kind of percolate in the minds of the Italians. Then shifting our focus further west to Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, also known by the Romans as the province of Hispania, later conquered by the Islamic Caliphate, becoming the Kingdom of Al-Andalus, part of the Umayyad Caliphate, breaking away. This area, the Christians were spending 800 years trying to reclaim from Muslims. But you'll also remember during the Umayyad Caliphate and the Abbasid Caliphate period, Muslims were going through their period of their golden age. And during this, they were studying the natural world as kind of a religious duty and trying to learn more about the ancient world. They also were collecting ancient texts of the Romans and the Greeks and building on these ideas along with their own observational studies. As Christians pushed Muslims out of Iberia, well, some of this information fell back in the hands of Christians, and trade, conquest, and translation helped move these ideas back east to Rome and the rest of Western Europe. And over here in the Italian peninsula, which is broken up into several different kingdoms, not quite the mess of the Holy Roman Empire, but still broken up into several different kingdoms, they still had cities with large populations ready to absorb this information. From the west, from the Reconquista, and from the east, from the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and it's all flooding right here into the Italian city-states. So that begs the question, why Italy? Why did the Renaissance start there? Why was the information flooding into the cities of Italy and not to the cities elsewhere? Well, that's a good question. For one, Italy actually never fully collapsed after the fall of Rome. This is why, calling the Roman Empire's collapse a collapse, kind of a misnomer. The empire kind of fell apart, but people were still living in these cities. They were still kind of going about their day-to-day. They didn't really fall into the full feudal system that you saw over in, Gaul or England or the Holy Roman Empire. Cities in the Italian peninsula remained pretty active centers of trade with large populations, and they were still kind of going about their day-to-day trading with the rest of the world for the most part. This urban life with large populations living close together encouraged interaction between large numbers of people. They exchanged ideas and competed with each other. Merchants, artisans, scholars, and the clergy all were living pretty close together, sharing these ideas, competing. And when you get large numbers of people talking and sharing and competing with each other, you start to see ideas spread faster, get pushed further, new technology is created. So ideas have this spread in cities that it's much faster than you find in rural feudal societies, so it becomes this perfect incubator for this period. Over the past 800 years that we were studying in the previous unit, we saw trade networks across Western Europe slowly rebuilding and reconnecting different areas. And the Mediterranean trade routes were still bringing wealth into the Italian city-states. That trade never really fully stopped, especially in cities like Venice or Naples. This is bringing a large amount of wealth into the cities that can connect to the other trade routes that are further east, where the real resources of value are, or Africa, where the real resources are. And the Italian cities are kind of perfectly situated in this central location in the Mediterranean to really take advantage of this. Right, Naples is right here in the center of the Mediterranean world. Venice is kind of this great point to sail up to, and then when you can get to the ports here in Venice, you can then connect to trade routes that go into the other parts of Western Europe, and so it's the shortest distance to travel that gives it a big advantage. It's in these cities you start to see banking and credit expanding economic power beyond land ownership. So now you can have power because of wealth, and that wealth isn't determined necessarily by the land you own, but by the gold and trade that you control. Families start to gain influence through money rather than noble titles, right? You don't have to be born into a noble family in order to have some power in society. What you can do is you can earn your way into that by making enough money, and banking is a great way to do that. One family in particular, known as the Medici family, they're known as the godfathers of the Renaissance because they were a banking powerhouse that basically buys their way into power across Italy and Europe, eventually even being able to buy the papacy itself, and getting one of their family members, actually a couple of them, named Pope. This gives them power from their wealth, but also gives them religious power over Europe. And with all this wealth being generated, this economic surplus of extra gold, more money and resources than you need to survive, it allows them to spend beyond basic survival needs. And with that extra money, it becomes a tool for gaining status and influence and legitimacy in society. Essentially, you can buy your way into power. You can buy your way into being seen as a person to be looked up to in society. The Italian peninsula is also politically fragmented, and these states are competing with each other, right? The Kingdom of Naples, Sicily, the Papal States, the Republic of Siena, the Republic of Florence, where the Medici family is from, plus all these other smaller states are kind of popping up all across the Italian peninsula, and they're in competition with each other, right? Power is concentrated in cities, not large kingdoms, and these cities are competing with each other. Rulers want to show that, look, the King of Naples wants to show how prestigious and how influential he is in society. But the rulers of the Republic of Florence are also trying to do the same thing. And they're all trying to one-up each other, and they're closely geographically connected, making this competition even more prominent. And while, yes, there were some battles and wars fought between them, essentially, there's always physical conflict, the real competition was by showing how great you were through the buildings that you financed, the churches and universities you built, the public art you paid to have your city beautified. You wanted people to come through your city and go, wow, this really is the greatest city in Europe or the world. And so culture becomes a visible form of political power. Look, I paid this money to these artists to create these great works of art that make our city greater than anywhere else, and so this is why you should let me be in charge. So it becomes this force of authority that's separate from land ownership, that's separate from political religious legitimacy, and art is a way to display this power. At the same time, the Catholic Church didn't go anywhere. There's still a very, very powerful force across Western Europe. And in many of these cities, the churches were the largest public spaces that everyone shared. If the point is for everyone to see this art in order to know that your family or you're the one who paid for it, you're going to want to put it in a spot that's going to get the most eyes. And, well, the church is where pretty much everyone goes, so that's a great place to get this art put. And so a lot of these wealthy families, they're called patrons, right? The people who are paying for this, they pay for beautiful churches and chapels to be built, and for altarpieces and art to be built and painted, and sculptures that are all religious to be put in these places, so that everyone knew, like, hey, this was donated by this powerful family, you should respect them because look what they're doing to this religious space. So supporting religious art strengthens the personal status of these wealthy families, but the church also is kind of building this relationship with these wealthy banking families. And just like the church had helped the kings with their political legitimacy, they're also helping these rich, wealthy merchants with their political legitimacy as well, and it becomes symbiotic, and you see this pattern that the church formed with the kings, forming again with these wealthy patron families. Now, art in the Middle Ages is overwhelmingly religious in nature, and you still see that in the Renaissance, but there is a subtle shift in the art in this period, in the meaning behind it. Now, the technique gets much, much, much better, right? But art is still mainly religious in subject. The artists begin to focus, though, more on realistic human bodies, right? You can see here the carving in the face of David, the curls in his hair. You can see the veins in his hand. It looks like this is a hand of a person who has really worked hard, calloused hands, the fingernails, the veins popping out. This looks like a human body that was turned to stone. There is a focus on, you can see the emotion in their faces, right? Look at this piece of art of Mary and Jesus sculpted out of a single piece of marble. Again, you can see the emotion, the expressions on their faces. The focus here was trying to capture that individual human experience in art. Humans become central to how religious stories are shown. It's not just trying to depict the divine, but to show humanity itself in a religious context. Faith is still extremely important, but meaning was increasingly expressed through what humans were experiencing, not what God was doing. So another source of this rediscovery of the classic past comes from all the ruins. Another reason Italy is a prime location for the start of the Renaissance is because the Roman ruins were pretty much everywhere. You couldn't throw a stone without hitting something that Romans had built across the Italian peninsula. And so artists and scholars and proto-scientists are looking at all these ruins. They're plentiful around the Italian peninsula, and they're seeing what the Greeks and the Romans were capable of. And they start to think, well, maybe there's something we can learn from the past. These classical models show balance, proportion, and realism, and this is all something that people start to get interested again as they start to look at the ideas of the past that are being brought back to Italy from the Reconquista and from the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. They're doing is they're looking to the past to help legitimize this new cultural authority instead of just looking for, say, legitimization through ownership of land or violence or religious belief. They're looking to say, hey, maybe we're powerful because we're part of this ancient tradition, and the past can be a way to justify our positions of power. This, of course, puts all the older systems under serious strain. The whole feudal hierarchy is based on the idea that the Christian God speaks through the Catholic Church, who appoints the kings and endorses the kings. The kings then divide up their land to the nobles and the knights, and the peasants kind of do all the work, and this is because this is what the God wants, and that's because it's what the Catholic Church says. But as knowledge starts to spread, these ideas start to get challenged. As land no longer is the sole source of power or wealth, well then the king's ability to dole out land makes them less powerful, giving them less control over the nobles. And as people gain a lot of wealth through trade, they no longer need a title of nobility that's handed down from birth in order to justify why they're better than others. And so the old systems need to adapt. They need to change in order to survive. As people are moving more and more into towns and back into cities, urban life is creating the space for ideas to spread. After all, when people are close to each other, they start to talk, they start to share ideas, and I have an idea that works, but I tell it to someone else, and they're able to slightly improve on it, and so on and so forth, and ideas start to really grow. This is actually why the internet is so powerful, because now everyone on the earth is pretty much connected, and so an idea can, be shared with someone on the other side of the planet who can improve upon it. You also see that wealth is funding art and education and experimentation, but that art, education, and experimentation is kind of a threat to the monopoly of knowledge that the Catholic Church has, and so that's going to be challenging older systems. And as you have competition between these new political forces, that competition is going to reward innovation and change in order to give yourself a leg up on your competitors. All the while, the church is still a thing. It's still very powerful, and it's trying to adapt, and it's still providing structure and legitimacy to this whole system, as everyone still looks to the church for answers. But as older ideas of the Greeks and the Romans are kind of leaking back into Italy from the Reconquista and the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, those older ideas are starting to provide models for excellence and authority that are separate from what the Catholic Church had been teaching, and that's going to put further strain on the Catholic Church's control over people, ideas, and religious faith. Okay, that's the end of our lesson. As always, rewrite today's goal, identify those 3 facts, don't copy and paste, guys. Actually write it out. It'll help you remember things. Think about it. Don't just do 3 random things. This is actually proven to help you do better on your tests and retain this information. And then one question you have that you'd like answered. Okay, until next time, we'll see you then.